All right. Well, good morning, people. Um, I'm going to start off giving our statement and disclaimer. Good to have everybody here. Before we begin, please note that this meeting is untiled and will be recorded to our YouTube channel, the Marquise de Lafayette Philomath Society. We anticipate a very engaging and open discussion. MLPS was created on December 10th, 2022 on the foundation of hosting lectures open to all topics familiar to Freemasonry, but not limited to those for the betterment and improvement of the craft. We are a public organization that is not Grand Lodge sanctioned. We welcome everybody for enlightenment and growth. To cover some ground rules, MLPS is internationally extends fraternal greetings and fellowship with siblings in a friendly and social manner. Our lectures are not a platform to engage in jurisdictional issues, but highly encourage fostering diversity, inclusion, harmony, and respect for all. As a disclaimer, any views expressed and/or opinions shared solely are the opinions of the participants and are not a reflection of the Grand Lodges nor lodges of membership. Therefore, please keep all conversations open to the public and in reflection of true brotherhood. All right, and today's speaker is our brother, Michael, and I'm going to chop up your last name because Brent Morris told me you don't pronounce in Pole. So go ahead
Just
and
think
pronounce it.
DOLL with a P.
Okay. And we're gonna discuss I guess the different degrees of the Scottish Rite with some hints of the French Rite, I believe, and Lafayette, because actually the 16th was Virginia's Lafayette Day that we celebrate his coming to Virginia and helping out with helping America become independent, or I guess the 13 colonies at that point in time. But I'll let you take it away.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here. What I wanted to talk a little bit about was actually, you mentioned the French Rite. The French Rite was one of three rituals that was worked in the early days of the Grand Lodge. In 1833, they had a constitutional change, and they made three official rituals. One was the so-called York Rite, which is American Web, the ancient accepted Scottish Rite, and the French or modern Rite. And they worked that until 1850. But today's discussion, I was going to focus on a little bit of the history and nature of the Scottish Rite craft lodge rituals, and some of the problems that we had, why they're so rare in the United States. And one of the things that I like to look at first is to try and understand a little bit about terms. And one of the big terms that we have is when we say Scottish Rite. And I've heard a number of researchers talk about the Scottish Rite craft lodges. And what they'll do is they'll go back to pre-1800, pre-1700s really, and they'll talk about some ritual that they found that's a Scottish Rite craft ritual from 17 whatever. And the problem is they're mixing rituals with organizations. And what we have is the ancient accepted Scottish Rite was created in 1801 in Charleston, South Carolina. That's the organization. And it dates no earlier than that. And if you're talking about a craft lodge that works under that particular organizational structure, if you go back prior to 1801, you're talking about something else. And so when you talk about a Scottish Rite craft ritual, and you say, I found a ritual earlier, a craft ritual from 1750, what you're actually saying is that you found a ritual that was later absorbed by the organization of the ancient accepted Scottish Rite, and they took it to use themselves. And you can't apply early dates because you have the Rose Croix ritual that is certainly used way early and by many different organizations. So when you talk about an earlier ritual and you mix up rituals with an organization, you end up with a lot of confusion. And if you could stick with talking about the rituals of the ancient accepted Scottish Rite, any of the degrees, you have to look at it as used by the ancient accepted Scottish Rite, the organizations that use them. And anything earlier or anything different is talking about a ritual, but not actually that particular organization. So that's one problem that we have when we talk about these type of rituals. And another issue that comes up, I actually was and it sound like it has nothing to do with the discussion, but actually it does, and I'll come back to that in a minute. I was watching a show not long ago, and they were talking about uh, early humans, or really Homo sapiens, and that would be us. And they trace them back to 200 to 300,000 years. And what they were doing in this show was they were trying to talk about how they lived back then and how we live today. And the bottom line was that they had an extraordinarily dangerous life, and they never knew from one moment to the next when they would live or die, and if something would jump out on them. And they tried to see various instincts that were developed in these early humans that actually still exist today. And one of the, well, two instincts that they focused on was fear and anxiety. And both of these have traced themselves back to this early time of man. And if you think about it, if a very early human was out in wherever, and all of a sudden a lion or some other big and bad animal came up on him, that's fear. He would, adrenaline would flow in him. He'd get nervous. He'd try to figure what can he do to preserve his life, and he'd be fearful. Uh, the other emotion that is more or less instinctual with us is anxiety. If that same early human was able to see something, an animal way in the distance, he'd recognize it as trouble, and he'd know that that was dangerous, but it wouldn't be an immediate danger. And so what he'd do is he'd watch it, but he'd feel concerned. He wanted to make sure that that thing stayed way over there. Now today, what we can have, if we're in a city and we're walking down a street and somebody jumps out with a gun or a knife or something, well, that's going to generate fear. And by the same term, if we're going down a dark city street and there's no one around, all of a sudden we see an alley up ahead of us, and we have to pass by that alley. We have a little anxiety about that because we could wonder, could somebody be in that alley? Are we in any danger? And we could feel concerned until we pass. And these early feelings go back to the earliest times of man, and they become instinctual. You may not want to feel this. You may not think about feeling. You all of a sudden will either, depending on the event, feel fear or feel anxiety. And if we trace this throughout time and humanity, now, Freemasonry models itself on the old operative Freemasons, whether that's actual or borrowed or stolen or whatever. We emulate operative Freemasonry. And one of the claims that are made by anti-Masons is that Freemasonry is such a dangerous organization because they have all kind of horrible rituals and all kind of horrible things they do to people and everything. And the truth is, from the very earliest time in operative Freemasonry, the harshest penalty was expulsion. But if you think about life in the 1500s, it was still dangerous. And these operative Freemasons, they worked in order to make a living, put food on the table. And if they did not have that work, they could be in a very serious state. They wouldn't know how to survive, and they may not survive. And so it was not nearly, the living conditions were not nearly as bad as several 100,000 years ago, but they were still dangerous. And living today is far better than the 1400s. We have, the vast majority, you decide to go out at night in your backyard, you may not be able to see things well at night, but there's still, you're reasonably certain that you could be safe. But we still today have feelings of concern and anxiety and fear at times, depending on what happens. Now, I'm going to take this and put it on the side for a second. And later on, I'm going to show how we bring all this together. When we talk about the ancient accepted Scottish Rite, it was created in 1801. There is no evidence that the original Supreme Council in Charleston, which is now in Washington, D.C., that they ever worked in the Scottish Rite craft ritual. But there's a lot of evidence, and very conclusive evidence, that the second, third, and fourth Supreme Council did work in the craft ritual, the complete 33-degree system. Now, New Orleans Masonry, its Scottish Rite came to New Orleans, as best as we can determine, it was in 1807, and it was several sovereign grand inspector generals from the Supreme Council of Kingston, Jamaica. That was Alexander de Grasse's second Supreme Council that he created. He created one in the Leeward Islands in 1802, and then one in Kingston, Jamaica in early 1804, and then late 1804, he created the Supreme Council of France. And each of those had a complete 33-degree system. But Masonry came to the New Orleans area in at least the earliest record we could find in 1752. There was a lodge created. Now, this is what I mentioned before about the ritual. The rituals they used were French in nature, and they were they could be called Scottish Rite because they were more of the old 25-degree system. But the actual 33-degree system rituals didn't come until about 1807, as far as we can tell. But what happened in 1807 was that a craft lodge was created in New Orleans for and working in the ancient accepted Scottish Rite ritual, and that was pre-United States. Louisiana was not part of the United States at that time. 1809, a Lodge of Perfection of this 33-degree system was created in New Orleans, and a Grand Consistory of the same system by the same SGIGs was created in 1811. And that Grand Consistory that was created in 1811 continues to exist today as the Valley of New Orleans. The Scottish Rite Valley of New Orleans is under the jurisdiction of the Southern jurisdiction. The 1852 lodge that was created merged into another lodge just after the creation of the Grand Lodge. And it's it's one of the lodges that merged with Perfect Union #1. So it still exists in a manner. Now, in the early days of Masonry, Louisiana was pretty much an island as far as the rest of the U.S. And they considered things that worked for them. They worked the ritual, they worked in the French language, they worked the rituals that they were used to. And a number of years ago, I found at Tulane University in New Orleans, I found a collection of rituals that they ended up being termed the Monseigneur rituals. And the reason was there was that was an individual who came from the West Indies and came into New Orleans. And he had a collection of this old, and it was a 25-degree system, a version of it. And it's a classic example of why this old version, the 25-degree system, was a problem, because they had so many versions of it. There was no central control, and it was problematic in a number of ways. But that ritual was probably used by the early lodges in New Orleans that were from the early days until the Grand Lodge of Louisiana was created in 1812. And it's likely that the Grand Lodge used that same ritual for their lodge and for their work, but we don't have records that all these records were destroyed later on. Now, this masonry that was being worked in New Orleans was in a city that turned out to be a very significant port for the United States as the Mississippi River coming down. And it was an island to itself, and it worked its own ritual. They had their own, it was French language, and it was not part of the United States, nor was it connected by culture. Most of American Masonry was English speaking, and the Grand Lodges of England, Ireland, and Scotland chartered most of the provincial Grand Lodges there. And after the Revolution, these Grand Lodges maintained the customs and nature that they had before. And when they started to organize and come up with their Grand Lodge system, they came up with an concept of having one jurisdiction per state, one ritual, and usually one language. So New Orleans at that time was not part of it, of this, and they continued to evolve with multiple rituals and with multiple languages per their custom. And right now, there are, under the jurisdiction of Grand Lodge of Louisiana, 10 lodges that work in the ancient accepted Scottish Rite ritual, craft ritual. And they originally, these lodges, that we have traces of the 5 different languages. There were English speaking, there were French, there was Italian, Irish, German, and Spanish, that they worked in these 5 different languages. And several of the lodges actually have a variation of the Scottish Rite ritual, and there's reasons for this. I'll get that in a minute. But what happened was they had all these different languages being worked in New Orleans, several different rituals being worked, and Americans coming down through the Mississippi. There was a lot of commercial trade. They'd come down into New Orleans, and a lot of them were Masons, and they'd come into the various lodges, and it was completely different. Their experience outside of New Orleans was basically all the same. They had their lodges, and they worked in English, and the ritual was pretty much the same from lodge to lodge, from state to state, but New Orleans was completely different. And finally, in 1812, Louisiana became a state. The Grand Lodge of Louisiana was created. And this problem about multiple rituals, multiple language, only seemed to get worse from people coming down into the city. They'd see this and they'd say, why are you working something different? And the Grand Lodge basically didn't understand what the problem was. Their concept, they operated pretty much like a European Grand Lodge. And by that, I mean, they felt that it was the right of each lodge, the worshipful master, to set their own ritual, as long as it was an accepted ritual, and conduct its work as they saw fit. And it wasn't the Grand Lodge controlling things. The Grand Lodge was there basically to collect returns every year and to make major decisions that were necessary to be made. So they were an overseer, but they didn't get into day-to-day business, especially of telling lodges what ritual they would use or what language they would use. If a group came that spoke German, and this did happen, they would say, you work your, and they would translate the ritual into German, and they'd work their lodge in German or whatever language they wanted. So Masons coming in, so there was a conflict between the Masons coming in and the already existing masonry that was being worked. So the Grand Lodge eventually said, look, enough of this. We're trying to accommodate as many different cultures as possible. If a group of Masons who are legitimate and they want to work in this ritual, they'll work in this ritual. Well, it ended up being a major conflict in just about every way. And by the 1830s, the type of rituals that were being worked had whittled themselves down to the ancient accepted Scottish Rite ritual, the French or modern Rite, and the York Rite. They had lodges that wanted to work in English and work their American Web ritual. Grand Lodge said, that's fine. But they had these three, and they were arguing with each other. And they had an event happened where a French or modern Rite lodge and a York Rite lodge got into such a bad dispute that by lodge resolutions, they broke fraternal relations with each other. Well, the Grand Lodge had to step in and said, well, you can't do that. That's our job to establish relations. The two of you are under our jurisdiction. You can't do that. Well, it caused a major problem. And while there is no evidence that the Southern jurisdiction ever knowingly controls Scottish Rite craft lodges, an interesting event happened with the Grand Consistory of Louisiana. Now, the Grand Consistory of Louisiana, today the New Orleans Valley, has been from time to time under no less than 5 different jurisdictions, and it's been under the Southern jurisdiction several times. It was under the Cerno Supreme Council in New York for a good number of years, and that during that time it was known as the Grand Council. But when the slumber period began, Cerno went down first, and the Grand Council was trying to reach them, couldn't reach them, so they passed under the Southern jurisdiction during that time for a short time, right before they went into their slumber. And the problem was that during this time, they couldn't communicate with anyone. And the Grand Consistory itself was concerned about both the York Rite lodges in New Orleans and the French or modern Rite, felt that both of them were going to take over. So they began issuing charters for Scottish Rite craft lodges, and they chartered 2 Scottish Rite craft lodges while under the jurisdiction of the Southern jurisdiction. Now, in fairness, I do not believe that the Southern jurisdiction had any idea that this was happening, because they simply had begun their slumber. They were not active. And I think if they had been contacted and known, they would have said, no, you can't do that, because of problems that happened much earlier and why they never used Scottish Rite craft lodges in their system. But that they're chartering these lodges caused the Grand Lodge to say, oh, wait a second, we charter lodges. And so they entered into a concordat, the Grand Consistory and the Grand Lodge. And they said, okay, the Grand Lodge will charter all lodges. However, we will create a body known as the Chamber of Rites. And what this body will do will provide for the 3 official rites that we're now expressing: the York Rite, the ancient accepted Scottish Rite, and the French of Modern Rite. And these three lodges will have representatives in this chamber, and we will supervise their work, and we will acknowledge them as legitimate in Louisiana. Well, the Grand Lodge felt that this was the perfect answer, and it satisfied the Grand Consistory. Grand Consistory says, okay, if we're assured that you're going to have Scottish Rite craft lodges, we'll go along with this. Grand Lodge says, yes, we will. York Rite said, absolutely not. York Rite says there will be one ritual, that's the York ritual, one language, that's English. Grand Lodge says that's unreasonable. They said, we have individuals who spoke French their entire life. They don't speak English. And they're the only, we got multiple 30, 40, 50-year members who have worked in these other rituals, and we can't do this. And the fighting continued. It continued. During the same time, the Southern jurisdiction was, for the most part, inactive. Southern jurisdiction, Northern jurisdiction, and Cerno Council all went because of the fighting. And this is not the place to, this is not this lecture's discussion to go into what happened there. But because of their fighting, the Scottish Rite all over ceased to exist except for in Louisiana. The Grand Consistory of Louisiana was for a period of time the only body of high-grade Scottish Rite Masonry in the U.S. And so they had and I don't even know if they realized it, to be honest, but when they came out of all of this confusion and slumber, there was already a Supreme Council was created in New Orleans in 1839, right during the slumber period. And they agreed and that they would not work in the craft lodge masonry, and they would begin from the 4th degree to the 33rd. Grand Consistory says, yes, we will no longer have lodges. We will work from the 4th degree to the 32nd. And the Grand Lodge was happy. The Scottish Rite bodies were satisfied that their craft lodges would be taken care of, and they would have them under the jurisdiction of Grand Lodge. York Rite went to war, and there was really bad fighting. Louisiana Masonry was almost destroyed because of the fighting that was going on during the period from the mid-1830s to mid-1840s. It was a very bad time, so bad that the York Rite Masons in New Orleans decided that they could no longer work within the frame of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana. So they petitioned the Southern jurisdiction's brand new SGIG from Mississippi, and who happened to have been the Grand Master of Mississippi, and can we get your support? And the Grand Lodge of Mississippi says, yes, we declare the Grand Lodge of Louisiana irregular. And we could issue charters for lodges in New Orleans area. So ended up 7 lodges were chartered by the Grand Lodge of Mississippi in the New Orleans area from the period in the mid to late 1840s. And these 7 lodges created the Louisiana Grand Lodge, ancient York Rite Masons. It was a competing Grand Lodge. And well, the Grand Lodge of Louisiana says, you're irregular, you can't do this, and they broke fraternal relations. No other Grand Lodge in the U.S. recognized this new creation except Mississippi. And what happened was, in a couple of years period, the Grand Lodge of Louisiana was overwhelmingly supported as the original and valid Grand Lodge, but they realized that there was a change in society taking place, and the French Masons could no longer assure that they could protect the ideas that they had prior to this, because the Grand Lodge was becoming, according to their term, American. It wasn't a French, it was becoming this English-speaking one, very hard line, very severe attitude that they had. And it was, we're going to do it this way, and that's it, period, boom. So the Grand Lodge of Louisiana said, they could see the handwriting on the wall. They said, we got to do something or else we're going to cease to exist. So they entered into a concordat with this second Grand Lodge, and they decided to merge. It was actually a takeover. And what happened was 3 of the Scottish Rite craft lodges that were existing since at that time petitioned the Supreme Council in Louisiana that had been created there. And at that time, one of the past Grand Masters was the Grand Commander of the Supreme Council, and just about every living past Grand Master was an SGIG in the Supreme Council. And they petitioned, they said, look, your Concordat of 1833 was violated. The Grand Lodge said that they were going to provide for our Scottish Rite craft lodges in writing through this agreement. And they're not. The new Grand Lodge, when it took over, it says Scottish Rite Masons are gone. You'll only have York Rite Masons. So they approached the Supreme Council and said, what are we going to do? They're telling us we can't exist. And the Supreme Council said, okay, since they did violate this agreement, we'll take you in. And that's when the Supreme Council of Louisiana began working in the Scottish Rite craft masonry. And that's why today the Grand Lodge of Louisiana, the Grand Lodge of Louisiana has a number of lodges which were formerly under the jurisdiction of the Supreme Council of Louisiana. I belong to 2 of them, and I was worshipful master of one of them. The Supreme Council of Louisiana continued until 1855, and then they took over that, and there was a concordat between the Supreme Council of Louisiana, or half of them, and the Supreme Council Southern Jurisdiction, and they merged that way. And Supreme Council of Louisiana, the problem was all the businessmen went with the Southern Jurisdiction, all the attorneys and judges went with the Supreme Council of Louisiana, and they said, we got a legal problem here. And they said, the Supreme Council of Louisiana still exists, and that's why they continue to exist to this day. But the Grand Lodge of Louisiana, there was a turmoil like anything. And the problem has always existed that people decide things because they want to decide things. And an example that really sticks out, and what I believe is the core problem, is this concept of fear. And our history is another aspect. We are, in most of our history books that we see, the history is actually history in a bubble. And what I mean by that is that we can give facts. If we say John Smith was part of an organization and John Smith was a Mason, and we want to have an understanding of the actual history, and we look only at what's going on, and we don't look at the total picture, we can have a system where John Smith is seen as a Mason, and you can prove it by minutes of the lodge, and you can prove it by minutes of the Grand Lodge, but we don't ask if there's an event that happened and someone says, well, we have records that John Smith says, I joined Masonry, but it's evil. You got to ask, why did John Smith say that? And if you don't ask the question why, then you're going to not get a complete understanding of the entire situation. And this is what I believe has happened throughout the years. We've never asked, why did these things happen? what was going on, what was in the minds of people, why did they act this way? And if we don't know that, we don't know the whole story. And this is the biggest problem that I've seen with so many aspects of our published history. We get things that are proven to be accurate, but they're not complete. They don't explain why of the situation. And this is what I can't say what's going to happen tomorrow or the next day, but we have an opportunity to look around outside the United States. The Scottish Rite Craft Lodges are one of the most popular around. Why? Inside the United States, they're hardly used. Rarely. Why? What I believe we need to look at is what's going on in Masonry and what's going on in the minds of the individuals who work these various lodges, and what is the ones who are looking at them thinking. And if we don't understand the whole story, then we're going to continue, and we have an opportunity. That's the bottom line. And what we do with that opportunity is going to depend on us. And in closing, I hope that what we do with the future is look more towards understanding each other and trying to figure out not just I want my way and this is what I do. I fear you because you're different than me. And this is a problem that maybe it's going on since the beginning of time, but we have to evolve in so many aspects, and not just in our personal lives and making more money, making better jobs, all this. We have to grow inside. And I think we start by doing a little better work understanding with people. And that's a general idea of what the Scottish Rite Masonry started, and it is a complete system. It is a 33-degree system. If you have a construction, if you have a magnificent cathedral and it's beautiful, but it starts on the fourth floor, then it has no foundation. And that creates a problem. And it is a complete system. And we can do better than we're doing. And if our goal is to improve ourselves, we have to do it in every aspect, not just certain aspects. But I thank you for allowing me to speak, and hope I didn't take too much time.
No, you're good. You're good. Thank you for, agreeing to do this. I really do appreciate you coming through and having that explanation. Um, right now I'm going to give the floor to the attendees to see if anyone has any questions.
Yeah,
Russell?
yeah, Cleo, thank you. First of all, thank you, Michael. I always appreciate your insight and your conversations. Here in the last 6 months or so, I developed an interest more in some Scottish Rite history. And what little I know about Louisiana all comes from you. I'm interested in the actual founding of Scottish Rite in Louisiana and its connection with the founders in Charleston and Albany. I'll make a statement, and if you can kind of direct me a little bit, the SGIGs out of the Jamaica area, they were the group. It was a particular brother or group that helped with the founding of Scottish Rite in Louisiana, and a different brother or group that started that was the forerunner of what became the Charleston Supreme Council and then later the Albany Supreme Council. Is that kind of true?
Well, the Charleston Supreme Council, there's not a scrap of evidence that there ever existed any 33-degree system prior to Charleston. And I know what the Grand Constitution of 1786, they talk about a Supreme Council in Berlin. No serious historian recognizes the grand constitutions as legitimate today, that they were made up. There's a lot of debate about who made them up, but the Charleston Supreme Council was the first guys. What happened was the Charleston Supreme Council, as amazing as that, appointed, they gave the 33rd degree, they appointed Alexander DeGrasse Tilley a SGIG. No, sir, they appointed him an SGIG, and they appointed him Grand Commander of the Leeward Islands in 1802. And from everything we have, DeGrasse created that 1802 Supreme Council. Then he goes to Kingston, Jamaica, and he creates the Supreme Council of Kingston, Jamaica, and then immediately goes to France and creates the Supreme Council of France. So these SGIGs that were from Kingston, they were under the body that DeGrasse had created, and DeGrasse had been created, the 33rd, by the Charleston Council. So by extension, it traces through there. Now, the northern jurisdiction, they had one of the SGIGs from that 1802 Supreme Council came through Antoine Bedeau. He came through New Orleans, and he left a collection of rituals and documents and fees and everything, which was standard. Then he was going to France, and he went to the northern jurisdiction in New York, and he created there a grand consistory. Now, I did a video, and it's a longer video, on the New Orleans Scottish Rite College. It's called the Scottish Rite Dilemma. It goes into detail about all of this, but he created this body there. But Cerno got into it because he learned of this system somehow. Don't know how he learned of the new 33-degree system, but when he got into, he held the same position, a deputy inspector general of the old 25th degree. And that was the same position that John Mitchell held. And through that authority, he became a 33rd. There's no clue who gave him the 33rd. It was an administrative process, and it's too detailed to go into here. Watch that video, the Scottish Rite Dilemma, and
I will.
cover. And what happened was Cerno, from everything we can see, the Grand Master was his lieutenant grand commander, and he was also political rivals, bitter political rivals with the guys from this other council that Bedeau created. So it kind of meshed. So it gets very complicated, and it's very ill explained. There's very little. It as the Scottish Rite battles started, everybody was pointing the finger at the other guy. You're wrong. No, you're wrong. Well, I'm going to show you why you're wrong. I'm going to show you why you're wrong. And rather than working together, they decided to make enemies of each other. And that's the bottom line. And one of the things, New Orleans, the first that we can trace is 1807, when the actual ancient, the 33-degree system that became known as the ancient accepted Scottish Rite, that's when it came into New Orleans. There was older systems, and I've had historians say, well, I got a Scottish Rite craft ritual from 17, so that's not within that 33-degree organization system. So it's very convoluted, it's very complex, it's very a lot of individuals over the years published things and said things that were absolutely incorrect. But because I have a book where a sitting Grand Master said that it is a fact that the first Grand Master of the Freemasons was King Solomon, and that's a fact. Well, it's, we in the 70s and 80s, they started a new process where you say it, you prove it. And that became more and more accepted. So we don't know all the answers to how the whole Scottish Rite system created. But the bottom line is the Scottish Rite is a perfect system as far as delivering of these moral lessons of self-improvement. And that's the key. And as long as we stayed with that, we can do better. If that helps any.
No, thank you, Michael. I appreciate it. And I will go watch that video.
It's long, I'm sorry.
No, as you point out, it's a difficult and convoluted history. And so, no, I appreciate the information.
All right, does anyone else have any questions? Jamila?
Yeah, thank you. I had to unmute myself. And you said something. Well, you started, and I was listening to all of it, but you said something that really, two things that really put the light bulb on in my head. One was contextual, and where and how things happen, and history happens, but you have to read and see and understand history according to the context of the time and of the people. And it reminded me of my days in seminary, in classes about world religions, and the history of even Christianity. If you don't take into account the context of the situation, you can't really see what's happening in the written word. So that was, so context really, just the word context. And the other thing is that history is who tells the story and what we want to believe about that and what that person brings to his writing, and I wish it was her writing, but his writing. And I just was amazed that, and I was sitting here thinking, you were saying 1830s and then 1850s, and you were giving me dates, and I was wondering what else was happening in Southern America at that time, and what was making people join and leave according to the politics of the time, and according to the economy of the time. And I appreciate everything you said because it made me think very differently about it.
A couple of things. I'll start with the second one first. The times, 1830s, 1850s or so, what was happening in New Orleans? New Orleans was an island. Things that were happening in New Orleans may not have been happening anywhere else, and usually were not. It was, I've heard people say, well, New Orleans is just another southern state or city, and that's not true. That's not true at all. It was very complex itself. The Creole community, what made a Creole, who was a Creole, who was not a Creole, and the structure that they had, it was completely different. And it was very harsh, very open, very confusing. It was its own little animal, and it was very different than any place else. And the problem that came is people coming from outside into New Orleans said, well, this is terrible. I don't like this. This is different. And people inside New Orleans said, well, what are you talking about? This is how we see things. And race was not an issue as far as the Creole community, who was defined as a Creole. Race didn't play it. You were a Creole if you had a little bit of French in you, a little bit of Spanish, and if you're born in New Orleans or an area up the River Road. And that encompassed a lot of people. And regardless of all the other situations, that one thing made a lot of people from outside New Orleans very angry at the New Orleans people and the idea that they could include Creole in any race. And what we understand of history, yeah, we have to understand that who's telling the story? Do they have something to gain by the outcome of the story? And this is one of the big things that we have to be careful about, because in Louisiana, there's an area known as Poverty Point. And what it is, it's an Indian mound that goes back 5,000 years. And they can't get all the information because they have all kinds of pottery, everything that they've discovered. They've done extensive excavations in that area, but the bodies are not present. And there's another mound, but it's on private property, and have never allowed them to get into that to find. It's probably a burial thing, but there's aspects of our history that we just don't know. And if we are going to be closed about it, then we may never know. But we have to recognize that we have to ask why. And if we don't have the complete story. If we don't have the complete story, we can't really say that certain elements that are provable fact is the whole story. If that
Well, I
makes any
think
sense.
I think pride and ego comes into asking that question, why?
Right.
Because
Yes.
the people are fearful, fearful of who they may become or who they may be asked to think about.
And fear is one of the instinctual fear and anxiety. I'm
Yeah.
to worry about this. And that was honestly what in Europe and all other areas, multiple rituals were worked in Masonry. There was never an issue, but for some reason, there was some reason that they said, no, everybody's got to be alike. Everything has to be the same. Boom, 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 boom. And all of a sudden they come to an area that's not the same. So that's got to be bad. That can't be a good thing. It's different than what we have. It's like there's only one flavor of ice cream, and if you're eating strawberry and they're eating Rocky Road, you say, well, this is terrible. You can't, everybody's got to be the same. And that was what I believe was one of the foundational problems of Masonry in the United States, was this insistence that you be alike. And
well, it was still they were still humans, and they were still products of where they came from,
right.
inside Louisiana and outside Louisiana. And their thinking, and their traditions, I think, overwhelmed how things happened. Because you bring that to the table every time you do it. Every time you have a discussion, or every time you leave the table, it is your, what's that? Can't think of the German word, but it is your way of looking at things, your worldview.
Yeah. And New Orleans Masonry, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that they did everything right, but they were absolutely convinced that their way was the right way, just as the other ones were outside Louisiana was considered that their way. And it seemed like there could not be a reaching of minds, because neither side wanted to explore the possibility that they could be in any way wrong and the other guy right.
Yeah, yeah. And that same attitude carried over in finance, in race relations, in everything else. So those were the same people, because otherwise you would not have had Masons killing Masons.
Yep.
I enjoyed this. Thank you.
All right, is there any other questions or comments anyone wants to share?
Question, are there still French-speaking lodges under the Grand Lodge of Louisiana?
The last French-speaking lodge was Etoile, and it's switched to English in the 1950s. Now, I was Worshipful Master of Chavantes number 5, which is one of the Scottish Rite Craft lodges, and it was originally a Spanish-speaking lodge. The year after I was the last English-speaking master, and the year following they have switched to Spanish-speaking, and they do most of their work now in Spanish-speaking. The problem was they didn't have enough Spanish-speaking Masons or members of that lodge to continue it in Spanish, and they switched around in the late 1980s. They switched from Spanish to English, and I had joined them as a plural member. And I ended up being master, and there was a enough Spanish-speaking Masons by the time we got through that they've switched. So the only non-English speaking lodge today is Cervantes.
Under the Grand Lodge of California, there is a French-speaking lodge in
Perfect Union.
it's called La Parfaite Union, and they work. I visited that lodge once. They're very famous for the French first degree. I've never attended the French first degree, but I understand there are actual ritual differences, not just language-wise, in the French first degree. So I might speculate that it's from the modern Rite.
No, it's from the Scottish Rite. And the reason I say that is Adam Kendall was working, and we shared a lot of information back and forth. The oldest lodge in New Orleans is Perfect Union #1. When all this commotion that I was talking about came about, the worshipful master of Perfect Union #1 was also the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana. And in 1850, when all of this happened, he grabbed a bunch of stuff and he took off and he went to California and he created that lodge. And
So La
so,
Parfaite Union actually comes from Louisiana.
right, right. And he stole. So that's by tracing that by Perfect Union is a York Rite Lodge today, but by working with Adam and tracing that ritual, that was the New Orleans Scottish Rite ritual, and he knew that things were crashing down, so he went to California with the rituals, and he created that lodge. And there was a second lodge, I can't remember the name of it, that had been created by John Gedge, who was the Grand Master of at that time, the irregular York Rite Grand Lodge that took over. And California eventually shoved that lodge out. They said, no, you're not legitimate. And they had this Perfect Union in San Francisco that was accepted as the legitimate one. So it's an interesting history, and it's very involved to get into all of this. So can't possibly do that today. But
That's an amazing history.
yeah, there's so much that's unknown. We about 6 years ago, after the Grand Lodge building in New Orleans had been sold, a hotel took it over, and one of the guys, the chief engineer, went up into one of the lodge rooms, cut a hole in the wall to do some electrical work, and when they got back there, something was stuck back in the wall. They pulled it out. It was a Jesuit communion press from the 1800s. Now, why was that sealed up in a lodge room wall? So it opens up a big connection between the Catholic Church and very early French Louisiana Masonry. And it's still a question that we don't completely have an answer to.
That's amazing.
Okay, we do have a question in the chat here on Zoom. Facebook, you could chime in if you have any questions. I'm logged in on my cell phone. Ivan, did you want to unmute and ask your question, or do you want me to read it? I guess I will read it. He said, hold on. Okay, he wants me to read it. All right, he's like, brethren, and oh, wait. You scroll back up. He said, great presentation, Brother Poe. We'll have to pay a visit to the brethren in New Orleans soon. One question, I know that other Grand Lodges that practice ancient accepted Scottish Rite craft degrees orate and make it a point to skillfully read through their ritual. Much different from Webb, York, and emulation lodges throughout North America, where memory is an emphasis. Do the ancient accepted Scottish Rite craft lodges of New Orleans do the same?
Some do, some don't. There is an approved ritual of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana for the Scottish Rite, It's not used. One of the problems was when this 1850, when all the fighting was going on, the Grand Lodge of Louisiana, after it agreed, okay, we will allow Scottish Rite craft lodges, it basically disavowed the ritual. And it said, we're not having anything to do with the ritual. So the ritual, each lodge became like a mini Grand Lodge, and the ritual has evolved a little bit. Some of the French Rite ritual has merged into some of the lodges, the older ones. But from lodge to lodge, some of them read the ritual, some of them memorize it. So there's no one standard for or one answer for that question. Some do read and some do memorize, and some read from the approved Grand Lodge ritual, and some read from their own ritual that they use, which is maybe a little different than the Grand Lodge approved ritual.
Thank you, Brother Paul.
Okay.
Any other questions from the floor? Well, if there's no I can't even talk today. If there's no other questions, then we will go ahead and conclude this lecture series. And I want to thank everybody for joining in. And just note that I'm gonna, for the people that registered, I'm building a email distribution list, like a friends list. So for future lectures, you will receive notifications of other lectures. All right, well, I want to wish everybody a warm and beautiful Saturday. I know it's nice outside, so I'm going to let you get to it. See you next time. And I'm going to end recording now.